An old silver gelatin photograph. Young men in sepia, frozen around a grandfather clock, their eyes locked on the camera. It looks like a dusty relic, an echo of forgotten youth. But watch as the emulsion fractures. The image shatters into a glowing, three-dimensional digital web. Arteries of light shoot out from these 15 faces, hardwiring directly to the Bay of Pigs invasion, the architecture of the nuclear triad, and the algorithms executing trillions of dollars in high-frequency trades. You spend your days locked in digital combat, debating political ideologies and casting votes in localized elections, believing your voice bends the arc of the universe. It is a comforting illusion. The brutal truth is that the heavy, tectonic currents of history are shaped in windowless rooms you will never be allowed to enter. Ignorance of this sociological gravity does not protect you. It makes you a blind passenger on a ship steered quietly by ghosts. I will give you the optics of a forensic sociologist to pierce this darkness. We are going to map these hidden constellations of power, node by node, until the anatomy of the shadow reveals itself. We will prove that the architecture of modern hegemony is not random, and it is not a chaotic accident. I will show you how to read the quiet poetry of these invisible strings, exposing a root system that feeds on secrecy and blossoms into global empire. Dusk settles over the Gothic spires of New Haven, Connecticut. The air grows cold as we push relentlessly down High Street until the collegiate architecture abruptly breaks. Sitting in the middle of a bustling modern city is a sheer, windowless block of brown sandstone. It does not belong here. It looks like an alien artifact, a monolith dropped from orbit, designed specifically to absorb the fading twilight and return absolutely nothing. To the trained eye of the investigator, this is not just a building. It is a meticulously engineered sensory deprivation chamber. This structure, known simply as the Tomb, was erected in 1856. Its sandstone walls are over 3 feet thick. There are no windows, no glass to shatter, no vents to breach. It was constructed with a singular paranoid purpose: to prevent any acoustic leakage and utterly neutralize the threat of visual surveillance. In the heart of a university dedicated to the relentless pursuit of enlightenment and the open exchange of ideas, this masonry vault stands as a monument to deliberate obfuscation. It is an architectural anomaly, a cold rejection of the democratic principles churning just outside its heavy iron doors. You can press your ear against the cold stone, but you will hear only the echo of your own heartbeat. The silence inside is a weaponized void. Every spring, exactly 15 college juniors vanish behind these heavy doors. Not 14, not 16. Exactly 15 men and women are tapped each year. In the chaotic, unpredictable flux of human sociology, this is a terrifying mathematical constant. It is a ritualistic drumbeat that has remained entirely unbroken for nearly 2 centuries, outlasting civil wars, global depressions, and the collapse of empires. Why this precise number? In the poetry of network theory, 15 is not just a tradition, it is a calculated structural limit for intense psychological bonding. It is the exact capacity for a tribe to maintain absolute loyalty without fracturing into factions. These 15 individuals are carefully extracted from the broader population and placed into a crucible, forging a synthetic kinship that will eventually supersede all other allegiances. Yet the physical fortress is merely the outer shell of a much deeper legal anomaly. The society operates under a corporate vanguard known as the Russell Trust Association. Despite existing in the epicenter of a major American academic institution, Its internal blueprints and vast financial holdings remain entirely opaque. It exists as a fiscal ghost, shielded from public taxation records by grandfathered legal loopholes written before the modern state even took shape. You cannot audit a ghost. The paper trail vanishes into a labyrinth of private trusts and ancestral wealth. In a forensic investigation, a total absence of data is, in itself, the most glaring evidence of systemic manipulation. When billions of dollars and generations of influence leave no discernible footprint on the public ledger, you are not looking at a tax evasion scheme. You are staring directly at an autonomous, sovereign entity operating within our borders. As we stand before these impenetrable sandstone walls, we must discard the cartoonish myths of secret societies. There is no magic here, no ancient scrolls dictating the future. The reality is far more clinical and far more terrifying. We are looking at a machine designed for the strict sociological reproduction of elite power. A machine that has run flawlessly since 1832, perfectly insulated from the friction of democratic oversight. It forces us to confront the central paradox of this investigation. How does a single, isolated room in New England manage to exert such disproportionate force on the entire geopolitical landscape? We are faced with the astronomical impossibility of its alumni list, a roster that casually includes presidents, Supreme Court justices, and the architects of the modern surveillance state. It is the exact paradox of a supermassive black hole. The anomaly itself emits absolutely no information, swallowing all light and sound that crosses its event horizon. Yet it is precisely this dark, silent density that gives it such immense gravity, quietly and violently dictating the orbital paths of every star, every planet, and every human life spinning in the darkness around it. That silent gravitational pull does not begin in the void of space, but right here, breathing quietly in the dust of the Yale Sterling Memorial Library. I watch the archivist, her gloved hands trembling slightly as she turns the brittle, yellowed pages of a leaked early 20th-century roster. The air down here is heavy with the smell of decaying paper and polished mahogany. We are looking for the exact coordinates where the anomaly begins, tracking the genesis of a statistical ghost. The camera lens pushes past the margins, macro-focusing on the faded ink of specific surnames bleeding into the parchment. Taft, Bush, Harriman, Goodyear. You see these names and your brain automatically registers American royalty. But I need you to strip away the myth and look at the cold, unforgiving math. Every single year, exactly 15 juniors cross the threshold of that sandstone tomb. 15 isolated data points in a sea of millions. We are taught to believe in the chaotic beauty of the American dream, a sprawling landscape where success is a random strike of fortune or the yield of solitary labor. But what are the odds of lightning striking the exact same patch of dirt 15 times a year for over a century? At a certain point, you have to stop calling it a thunderstorm and start looking for the copper wire buried in the earth. The illusion of randomness is the greatest trick the architect ever played on you. Let us quantify the corpse of this coincidence. Out of a modern population of roughly 340 million Americans, we are asked to accept a miracle. We are expected to believe that 3 future presidents, 2 chief justices, and a revolving door of secretaries of state just happened to share the same claustrophobic room in their early 20s by pure, unadulterated chance. In the realm of forensic sociology, the mathematical probability of this occurring naturally is effectively 0. When an equation balances to zero, you are no longer observing nature. You are observing engineering. A detective looks at this roster and sees a ledger of alibis that simply do not add up. If meritocracy is the religion of the modern world, then this list of names is the ultimate blasphemy. It proves that the apex of human influence is not scaled by the strongest climbers, but reserved for those who hold the master keys to a private elevator hidden in the dark. To understand the weapon, we must borrow the optics of network theory. When analysts map complex systems, from viral pathogens to internet traffic, they look for structural biases. They search for the hidden gravity wells that corrupt the natural flow of information. The tomb is not an incubator for raw talent. It is a meticulously calibrated gravity well. In the cold vocabulary of data science, this phenomenon is called preferential attachment. It is a terrifyingly elegant dynamic where highly connected nodes acquire new connections at an exponential rate. The rich get richer, not just in capital, but in access. Once a node, or in this case, a young man from New Haven, crosses a certain threshold of social connectivity, he generates an inescapable gravitational pull, bending the trajectory of everyone and everything around him. There is a melancholic poetry to this kind of absolute power. It is the physics of a snowball rolling down a mountain of human ambition, gathering mass until it triggers an avalanche that buries the valley below. Preferential attachment guarantees that the future is never a blank canvas. It is a pre-rendered landscape, painted by the spectral hands of the past. The men on this faded roster did not predict the 20th century. Their engineered proximity allowed them to simply dictate it. The most chilling revelation buried in these archives is the selection criteria itself. The society does not seek out the diamond in the rough. It deliberately targets individuals who already possess towering reserves of social capital. It acts not as a humble creator of talent, but as a ruthless aggregator and multiplier of existing dynastic power. It is a fusion reactor designed to take the heavy isotopes of American aristocracy and compress them into a weaponized sociological core. You look at the grand tapestry of geopolitical history and see the chaotic clash of ideologies. But beneath the surface, the loom is entirely static. When you trace the lineage of a corporate merger or a sudden diplomatic pivot, you often hit a dead end, a shadow transaction that defies market logic. That is the echo of the tomb. The archivist turns another page, and the dust that rises is the disintegrated remains of the free market, choked out by an invisible, inherited monopoly. We are watching the relentless mathematics of elite reproduction in real time. It is a closed-loop system that artificially restricts the oxygen supply to anyone outside the vault. The society understood, long before the algorithms of Silicon Valley, that whoever controls the network controls reality. By monopolizing the nodes of trust, they effectively monopolized the future, ensuring that the levers of empire would only ever be pulled by hands forged in the exact same fire. The true horror of this archive is not what it contains, but what it excludes. Every name etched into this yellowed parchment represents 1,000 brilliant minds that were quietly locked out of the command center. We are staring at the definitive proof that the grand theater of human progress is heavily curated. The audience is permitted to cheer and weep at the unfolding drama, completely unaware that the director, the producer, and the lead actor all share the same dark secret. But proximity alone is not enough to sustain a multi-generational empire. You can put 15 future kings in a windowless room, But without a binding agent, their egos will eventually tear the network apart. To forge an unbreakable chain, you need a fire hot enough to melt away the individual self. You need a mechanism of psychological surrender so absolute that betrayal becomes biologically impossible. And that mechanism is hidden in the shadows of the initiation rite. That mechanism requires a descent into the abyss of the human psyche. I step into the reconstruction of this psychological crucible, where shadows of 15 young men flicker against ancient brickwork. The air in this windowless tomb feels suffocating, heavy with the scent of melting wax and the oppressive rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock. It is not a meeting of minds, but an autopsy of the ego. You might assume that empires are cemented by gold, lucrative contracts, or shared political dogma. But pure capital is a fragile glue, easily dissolved by a higher bidder. To forge an archetype of loyalty that outlasts stock market crashes and shifting borders, you must drill deeper into the collective unconscious. You do not buy a man's permanent allegiance. You must hold his deepest, most visceral shame in your hands. The anomaly here is the method of execution. In any standard corporate or political environment, vulnerability is a liability, a weakness to be ruthlessly exploited by rivals. Yet inside these 3-foot-thick walls, the conventional rules of survival are inverted. The ticking clock measures the systematic dismantling of their armor. I watch the flickering silhouettes and realize this is a calculated sociological crime. The protocol of this metamorphosis is brutally simple, yet devastatingly effective. Within the absolute, suffocating darkness of the inner sanctum, each initiate is compelled to vocalize their entire sexual and personal history. They must lay bare every moral failure, every hidden desire, every pathetic fear, before the silent judgment of the other 14. It is a terrifying confessional, designed to strip away the curated persona. By surrendering their darkest secrets, they are not seeking absolution. They are building an architecture of mutual assured destruction. If one falls, the entire foundation collapses. You are watching the deliberate construction of a psychological hostage situation. When 14 future senators, judges, and intelligence directors possess the power to utterly destroy you overnight, your fate is no longer your own. The mechanics of this forced intimacy are rooted in the coldest equations of evolutionary psychology. Modern neuroimaging from the year 2022 confirms that synchronized extreme vulnerability acts as a biological override. The process violently bypasses the rational neocortex, the part of you that evaluates risk and reward. Instead, it strikes directly at the ancient primal architecture of the limbic system. This limbic hacking triggers a flood of oxytocin and vasopressin, the exact same neurochemical cocktail that binds soldiers together in the trenches of an active combat zone. The brain stops distinguishing between the self and the tribe. To the observer, these are privileged Ivy League students sitting in a dark room, but biologically, they have survived a simulated near-death experience together. The trauma is artificial, but the chemical scars are completely real. It is a dark, melancholic poetry. The very trauma that breaks the individual creates an invincible chimera. I look at the flickering candlelight dancing on the cold stone and see the birth of a phantom organism. They walk in as 15 isolated fragments of dynastic wealth, burdened by the expectations of their bloodlines, and they emerge as a single, undivided consciousness. The individual is dead. Only the echo of the tribe remains. This weaponized intimacy is an investment that matures over decades. Fast forward 30 years, and you will find these same silhouettes sitting across from one another at the highest tables of global diplomacy. One might represent a massive regulatory agency, while the other defends a sprawling multinational conglomerate. They perform a public pantomime of fierce ideological opposition for the cameras, convincing you that the system is adversarial. But the public conflict is a carefully choreographed illusion. Beneath the expensive suits and the polished rhetoric, their nervous systems are still tethered to the oppressive dark of this sandstone tomb. Their primary biological allegiance will always remain anchored to the psychological safety of the brotherhood, rather than the citizens they supposedly serve. The fate of millions is quietly decided by the silent gravity of shared youthful shame. This is the missing variable in every geopolitical equation that seems to defy logic. You wonder why a specific piece of legislation inexplicably dies in committee, or why a controversial banking bailout is universally approved behind closed doors. You are looking for a paper trail of bribes or encrypted emails, but the transaction was completed long before the crisis even began. The currency was not dollars, but the unadulterated fear of exposure. We are staring into the abyss of human nature, a void where ethics are replaced by pure survival mechanics. The architecture of modern American hegemony was not drafted in brightly lit parliaments or transparent public forums. It was cultivated here, in the cold, flickering shadows of forced confessions. It is the ultimate sociological crime, a phantom network operating beneath the surface of reality, immune to the democratic process. Once this unbreakable psychological core is forged, it requires an external vessel to house its power. The tribe cannot remain confined indefinitely within these windowless walls. They need a theater of operations vast enough to encompass the globe, a shadow realm where secrecy is not just a ritual, but the fundamental law of survival. The biological chain is complete. Now they must build the intelligence apparatus of an empire. To build the intelligence apparatus of an empire, you cannot rely on public trust. You require an architecture of shadows already fluent in silence. Deep within the rare books vault of the Sterling Memorial Library, surrounded by the smell of decaying paper and polished mahogany, the archivist opens a classified dossier from 1942. Beside it rests a fading collegiate yearbook. The smiling, youthful faces on these pages are about to become the phantoms of a global war. The anomaly here is not the violence of the conflict, but the rapid, almost unnatural assembly of the Office of Strategic Services. A nascent spy agency cannot simply hire civilians and hope they understand the absolute gravity of classified operations. The detective of history must ask, where do you find a pre-existing shadow network during a planetary crisis? Where do you recruit men who already know how to swallow a secret and take it to the grave? The answer lies buried under the hum of the vault's climate control, hidden within the brittle, yellowed rosters. The historian traces a gloved finger across a map of Europe dotted with threat assessment pins, then draws a direct line back to a windowless sandstone building in Connecticut. The government did not need to invent a culture of espionage from scratch. They simply borrowed a psychological ecosystem that had been perfecting the art of the dual life for over a century. During the frenetic formation of the Office of Strategic Services, the precursor to the modern CIA, recruitment officers bypassed standard military channels, heavily favoring these elite collegiate societies. To the logistical mind, it was a masterpiece of terrifying efficiency. The grueling psychological background checks were essentially pre-completed by the institutional culture of the tomb. The state did not need to test their loyalty.
the brotherhood had already bound their souls.
Think of a secret as a living, parasitic entity that demands immense mental energy to contain. Ordinary men crack under the sheer weight of a double life. But these young men had spent their formative years lying seamlessly to their professors, their families, and their closest friends. The archivist stares at the faded ink of the roster, realizing that the psychological trauma of their initiation was not a hazing ritual. It was a rigorous boot camp for high-stakes deception.
As the fires of the Second World War cooled into the long, paranoid twilight of the Cold War, the nature of combat fundamentally changed. It was no longer about moving mechanized infantry across physical borders. It became a war of the mind. The key architects of this new intelligence infrastructure, the very men who managed the early integration of psychological warfare and global surveillance networks, shared the exact same collegiate initiation rites in absolute darkness.
They were the authors of a new, invisible reality.
Through the melancholic lens of the historian, it is a chilling poetic symmetry. The individuals drafting covert operations to topple foreign governments were operating on the exact same limbic frequencies forged in that windowless room. They projected the paranoia of the tomb onto the geopolitical stage. The world was neatly divided into two categories: the initiated brethren who held the truth, and the blind masses in the dark. To govern this twilight realm, they codified a legal and moral loophole that would define American foreign policy for the next 80 years. They called it plausible deniability. It is the bureaucratic mechanism by which the highest echelons of power can authorize an atrocity, a coup, or an assassination, while maintaining complete and total ignorance on paper. To the forensic investigator, this is not just a tactical doctrine. It is a profound psychological confession. The culture of plausible deniability perfectly mirrors the dual existence required of a 20-year-old student who must actively deny the reality of his brotherhood while living amidst his uninitiated peers. The archivist turns another page, listening to the dry rustle of the paper. It is the sound of a private collegiate game scaling up to become the official operating system of a nuclear superpower. The mechanics of the campus lie became the heavy architecture of state secrecy.
You cannot separate the dancer from the dance, and you cannot separate the spy from the ghost of his youth. The vault feels colder now, the mahogany less like furniture and more like a coffin for the truth. When a covert operative erases a paper trail or funds a proxy army through an untraceable offshore account, he is merely executing the grander, deadlier version of the omerta he swore while standing over a grandfather clock in New Haven. This is the tragic poetry of the intelligence state. It is not staffed by rogue villains twisting their mustaches in a comic book lair. It is populated by men who genuinely believe they are the designated shepherds of a fragile, chaotic world. Their shared trauma convinced them that the truth is a dangerous radioactive substance, one that must be carefully managed by a select few. They do not hide the facts out of malice, but out of a deeply ingrained, paternalistic fear. Yet, to maintain this colossal, invisible empire spanning continents, one requires more than just silence and shared ideology. You cannot fund black sites, satellite constellations, and phantom armies with mere collegiate loyalty. The archivist carefully closes the OSS files, the heavy cardboard echoing like a judge's gavel in the stillness of the library. The psychological root system has firmly taken hold in the soil of government, but it is starving for a different kind of energy. The phantom network must eventually touch the physical world to extract the resources necessary for survival.
To manipulate the physics of the future, the architects of secrecy needed an engine capable of moving mountains of wealth without drawing the gaze of the public. They needed to marry the dark arts of intelligence with the cold, mathematical brutality of Wall Street. The ghosts of the tomb were about to step onto the trading floor, turning capital into a weapon of covert war. The ghosts of the tomb did not remain confined to the dusty archives of state intelligence. I am standing in the deafening roar of a modern high-frequency trading server room, surrounded by miles of fiber-optic arteries pulsing with cold, blue light. To the observer, the glass cabinets violently flicker, overlaying the polished shoes and tailored suits of 1920s Wall Street bankers. The transition from espionage to high finance was never a leap. It was an inevitable, predatory migration. To understand how this shadow architecture funds its global reach, you must strip away your domestic illusions about wealth. Money is not the paper in your wallet, nor the digital digits in your checking account. Money is the condensed time of human lives. It is pure kinetic energy captured in an offshore ledger. Whoever dictates the subterranean currents of capital effectively controls the physics of the human future, bending the trajectory of nations without firing a single shot.
This is the corpse we are examining today, an endless, untraceable flow of capital that defies the laws of a free market ecosystem. You cannot fund the vast, planetary-scale apparatus of the Cold War, or orchestrate silent coups in the global south, using congressional budgets subject to public scrutiny. The architects of secrecy required an engine capable of moving mountains of wealth in absolute darkness. They found their perfect host in the labyrinth of American investment banking.
Examine the historical fusion between towering financial firms like Brown Brothers Harriman and the highest levels of the United States State Department. Long before the public was ever alerted to a geopolitical crisis, private capital had already deployed its invisible armies. Elite investment bankers, bound by the psychological chains of their collegiate rituals, began dictating foreign interventions. They turned the foreign policy of a superpower into a private equity portfolio.
It is a quiet, devastating tragedy. The men who moved these unimaginable fortunes did not view themselves as corrupt.
Through their melancholic, paternalistic lens, they were simply allocating resources to stabilize a chaotic world. When a sovereign nation threatened their financial architecture, a swift, orchestrated market collapse was ordered over a discreet lunch. The bleeding of foreign economies was justified as necessary collateral damage in the grander symphony of global order. This systemic illusion was not left behind in the 20th century. As the cables in this server room hum with the processing of billions of trades per microsecond, they are executing algorithms built upon that very same historical bedrock. We are taught to revere the free market as a democratic equalizer, a Darwinian arena where the best ideas naturally rise to the surface. But the data from modern macroeconomic analysis reveals this arena is a carefully constructed hologram.
In the modern economic ecosystem, capital itself is no longer the ultimate prize. Information is the only true currency. When you analyze the profound overlap of intelligence directors simultaneously sitting on the corporate boards of the largest multinational banks, a chilling picture emerges. This creates an asymmetric knowledge advantage, a structural cheat code that effectively eliminates genuine free market competition. They are not predicting the future. They are reading the script. How can you compete against a trader who already knows the outcome of a classified drone strike before the missile has even left the silo? You cannot. The game is mathematically rigged. This invisible web of shared intelligence and corporate power
ensures that the descendants of the tomb always hold the winning hand. The market merely absorbs their decisions, a passive ocean reacting to the tectonic shifts engineered by men who still operate under the absolute mandate of silence. We must apply the cold rigor of topological mathematics to this crime scene. Advanced financial data shows that networks possessing high centrality, specific nodes directly connected to other highly connected nodes, possess a terrifying gravitational pull. These hyper-centralized actors can manipulate the overarching trajectories of global markets using only a fraction of the capital required by outsiders. They move a pebble and cause a landslide. This is the poetry of systemic leverage. Because these individuals share the profound, weaponized intimacy forged in their youth, their financial networks operate with absolute frictionless trust. While ordinary hedge funds bleed capital through friction, legal compliance, and paranoia, the inner circle executes synchronized global strategies based on a single encrypted phone call. The root system is alive, drawing water from the public economy to nourish the canopy of the elite. You feel the consequences of this invisible architecture every time you check your shrinking savings account or pay exorbitant prices for basic energy. Inflation is not a naturally occurring weather event. It is the deliberate theft of your past labor, orchestrated by the friction of these massive capital movements. You are the battery powering this shadow machine. Your economic anxiety is the necessary byproduct of their demand for total, unassailable geopolitical stability. I have tracked these transactions across decades, watching the phantom ledger bleed into reality. It is a terrifying realization that the heavy currents of history, the rise and fall of interest rates, the sudden funding of proxy wars, are dictated by the ghosts of a college ritual. The math is undeniable, and the sociology is flawless. We are observing a closed loop of power, a perfect sphere of influence that requires absolute darkness to maintain its compounding interest. If the sheer scale of this mathematical certainty, the realization that your entire economic reality is a carefully managed terrarium, blows your mind as much as it does mine, hit the like button. Do you think a truly free market ever actually existed, or was it always a ghost story? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and to ensure you do not miss the final solution to this historical mystery as we pull back the digital curtain, you must subscribe to this channel right now. We stare at the blinking lights of the server racks, searching for the face of the enemy in the code. But there is no singular villain typing commands into a terminal. There is only the chilling, automated hum of class reproduction disguised as a financial algorithm. The boys who stood trembling in the windowless sandstone tomb are gone, replaced by automated, high-frequency phantoms. But the psychological mandate they programmed into the system continues to execute flawlessly. Yet the architects of this financial hegemony made one fatal miscalculation. They built their empire on the assumption that the shadows would always remain impenetrable. They did not anticipate the relentless, unforgiving evolution of data science. The very fiber optic cables they used to move their trillions are leaving a permanent, indelible scar on the digital landscape. The ledger is out there, bleeding data, and we finally have the algorithmic tools to read the ink. The ink of the 21st century is not found in dusty ledgers, but in the cold, unforgiving glow of a terminal screen. Through the eyes of the open-source intelligence analyst, seated in the suffocating silence of a windowless server room, the history of power is being rewritten, line by line. We are no longer hunting ghosts in the archives. We are tracking their digital footprints through a labyrinth of dark money. On the dark mode interface, a Python script executes with ruthless precision. It is aggressively scraping millions of public records, searching for the invisible threads that bind the elite. This is the ultimate tragedy of the digital age for the architects of the shadow world. You can hide your face behind sandstone walls. You can swear oaths of silence in the dark, but you can no longer hide your metadata. The abyss of the internet remembers everything, and it is entirely without mercy. Every transaction, every private flight log, every seemingly random appointment to a corporate board leaves a microscopic scar on the digital fabric of our reality. The analyst watches as a massive, glowing web begins to pulse on the monitor. It is a beautiful, terrifying constellation of human ambition and systemic greed. Using advanced graph databases developed in the early 2020s, data scientists can now visually map the exact overlap between private club memberships, defense contractor boards, and federal policy committees. It is a digital autopsy of the American empire. The script connects a node in New Haven to a munitions manufacturer, then traces a glowing line to a closed-door intelligence briefing. The visualization lays bare a startling demographic reality, a statistical echo of the tomb itself. When the algorithm isolates the core nodes of corporate and intelligence boards spanning the last 50 years, the data reveals a chilling homogeneity. Over 85% of these hyper-connected seats were held by white males from identical socio-economic backgrounds, a deliberate bottleneck of power. To the untrained eye, the modern world appears as a chaotic storm of random events. A sudden shift in foreign policy, a synchronized crash in emerging markets, an unexpected surge in defense spending. But the analyst sees the tragic poetry of the underlying code. These are not coincidences. They are the synchronized heartbeats of a singular organism. The digital web pulses, pulling disparate threads into a tight knot. The algorithm dives deeper, running a comparative analysis of historical crises against the newly de-anonymized network graph. The results are a devastating blow to the illusion of democratic agency. Algorithmic analysis of historical data reveals that over 40% of critical geopolitical pivot points in specific decades can be traced back to a network of fewer than 200 overlapping individuals. Think about the sheer, staggering weight of that number. Fewer than 200 human beings, bound by ancient oaths and shared psychological trauma, quietly acting as the hinge upon which the fate of billions of lives turned. Wars were declared, economies were shattered, and borders were redrawn, all dictated by the quiet consensus of men who shared the same dining club. History is not a river, but a privately owned canal. The script continues to compile, cross-referencing campaign finance records with offshore registries in Panama and the Cayman Islands. The analyst watches a transaction of $2.4 billion dissolve into a network of dummy corporations, only to miraculously reappear as a political donation. It is the bureaucracy of betrayal rendered in glowing syntax. The perfect crime is hidden in the overwhelming volume of data. But the shadows are finally dissolving. Blockchain de-anonymization and advanced metadata scraping have systematically destroyed the traditional concept of secrecy. We are stripping away the protective layers of the ghost machine. The architecture of influence is no longer a conspiracy theory whispered in the dark. It is now a mathematical certainty, visible to anyone who knows how to query the code. There is a profound melancholic beauty in watching the invisible architecture of power collapse under the weight of its own digital footprint. The men who built this system believed their bloodlines and their silent nods would protect them for eternity. But algorithms do not respect bloodlines, and they do not keep secrets. They only recognize patterns. And the pattern glowing on the screen is a masterclass in extraction.
Follow the pulsing lines on the monitor. Follow the money as it flows from the military-industrial complex back to the Ivy League endowments, a perpetual motion machine fueled by engineered instability. The database reveals that the architects of the tomb did not just build an intelligence apparatus. They built an unbreakable loop of sociological reproduction. They ensured the keys would only be handed to those already inside. The digital web on the screen is not just a map of power. It is a graveyard of stolen futures. Every glowing node represents a decision that prioritized the survival of the network over the prosperity of the public. We are witnessing the forensic reconstruction of a century-long crime scene. The analyst leans back in the sterile chill of the server room, realizing the greatest trick the elite ever pulled was convincing us they did not exist. But the code cannot lie. The massive dataset compiled by the Python script stands as an irrefutable testament to the gravity of human networking. We have ripped the roof off the sandstone tomb and exposed its inner workings to the harsh, unforgiving light of open-source intelligence. The ghosts of New Haven have finally been digitized, indexed, and quantified. Their magic is gone, replaced by algorithmic certainty. Yet as the glowing web reaches its maximum density, illuminating the entire screen with the blinding truth of our systemic subjugation, a deeper, more unsettling question begins to surface. Are these overlapping nodes of power the result of a conscious, malicious conspiracy orchestrated by a shadowy cabal? Or is the reality far more terrifying? Perhaps we are not looking at a deliberate crime, but simply the tragic physics of human nature. You look at the cold, hard data mapping a century of engineered dominance, and the immediate instinct is to look for the villain. You want the cartoonish comfort of a smoky room where a dozen men sit around a mahogany table, consciously plotting the subjugation of the global working class. But as I watch this bruised evening sky, the truth reveals itself to be far more elegant and infinitely more terrifying. It is not malice. It is gravity. Look up at the murmuration of starlings shifting above us. Millions of birds turning in perfect synchrony. A fluid organism, carving violently beautiful mathematical equations into the dusk. There is no alpha bird calling the shots. There is no central committee dictating the flight path. Yet, they move as a singular, impenetrable force. The scariest truth is not that a shadowy cabal controls the world from a secret meeting room. The scariest truth is that they do not even need to hold a meeting. To the forensic sociologist, this synchronized flight is the ultimate manifestation of what is clinically termed class reproduction. The elites of the 21st century do not need to actively conspire to maintain their stranglehold on the architecture of power. Instead, they simply act in perfect, unquestioning accordance with a shared worldview cultivated in identical, hyper-insulated environments. They are flying on the exact same sociological thermals. When you take 15 ambitious young men, strip them of their psychological defenses, and rebuild their baseline reality inside a windowless sensory deprivation chamber, you do not just forge friendships. You calibrate their internal compasses to magnetic north. Decades later, whether they are writing monetary policy or authorizing drone strikes, they do not need to coordinate their actions. They will independently arrive at the exact same conclusion because their cognitive baselines are identical.
You spend your life debating the nuances of localized elections, hoping to shift the needle of progress by a fraction of a degree. Meanwhile, the heavy currents of history are moving beneath the surface, steered by a collective unconscious you are mathematically barred from accessing. The tragedy of our modern political theater is that we are arguing over the script, while the network owns the theater, the stage, and the very oxygen in the room. Consider the anatomy of a global crisis. In the year 2008, when the financial markets entered a state of cardiac arrest, the men at the helm did not turn to public referendums or democratic oversight. Human biology dictates that, in moments of existential panic, individuals instinctively reach out to the nodes they trust the most. When your entire circle of absolute trust was forged in the same collegiate crypt, your solutions will inevitably default to protecting that specific architecture. It is systemic bias operating on an apocalyptic scale. The intelligence director does not pick up the phone to collude with the Wall Street banker out of overt corruption. He makes the call because that banker is the only man on earth who witnessed his darkest confession at age 20. They save the bank, they save the empire, not because they hate you, but because in their shared biological reality, you do not even exist. You are just noise outside the sandstone walls. This is the quiet poetry of systemic corruption. It does not require suitcases of untraceable cash or encrypted satellite phones. It merely requires the absence of friction. When every gatekeeper of institutional capital and every architect of foreign policy shares the exact same operational DNA, the system seals itself off from external mutation. The network becomes a self-healing organism, ruthlessly filtering out any ideology that threatens the structural integrity of the root system. This brings us to the ultimate weapon in their sociological arsenal, the manipulation of the Overton window. The genius of this hyper-connected network is that they do not waste energy telling the public exactly what to think. That is a primitive strategy doomed to fail. Instead, they leverage their centralized influence to strictly dictate the acceptable boundaries of what can even be discussed in the mainstream arena. By dominating the boards of media conglomerates, elite academic institutions, and federal policy committees, the network quietly frames the parameters of human possibility. They decide which economic theories are considered pragmatic and which are labeled radical. They build an invisible, intellectual electric fence. Within those confines, you are given the illusion of fierce democratic debate, but genuine, systemic change that threatens the root structure becomes mathematically improbable. Look again at the dark, shifting mass of the murmuration above the tree line. If a single starling attempts to break formation, to fly against the mathematically predetermined current, it is instantly exposed to predators. The flock does not punish the rebel. The sheer physics of the environment simply eliminates it. The social architecture of the American empire operates on the exact same merciless biological principle. Conformity is survival. Independence is professional suicide. I've tracked the metadata across a century of warfare and engineered financial booms, searching for the smoking gun of a grand conspiracy. But the most terrifying realization is that the system operates in broad daylight, hiding behind the mundane bureaucracy of human nature. The greatest threat to your liberty is not an evil genius stroking a white cat. It is a profound lack of sociological diversity at the highest echelons of human management. We are trapped inside a self-replicating algorithm of privilege. The men who built the initial nodes of this network are long dead, but their psychological ghosts still pilot the machine. The legacy of New Haven is not a collection of esoteric artifacts. It is a sociological virus, perfectly adapted to bypass the democratic immune system. The tomb was never just a building. It was the incubator for a dominant new species of influence. To dismantle this architecture, we have to stop fighting shadows and start understanding the brutal mechanics of class reproduction. You cannot vote out a psychological bond. You cannot legislate away the limbic connections formed in the dark over a century ago. The invisible web we mapped on those servers is heavier than gravity, binding the hands of presidents and the trajectories of global markets with the quiet, inescapable force of a shared hallucination. As the last light drains from the bruised sky, the murmuration settles into the trees, completely dissolving into the darkness, as if it never existed at all. The illusion of a free and random world is seamlessly restored. But once you have seen the mathematics of the swarm, you can never unsee the invisible strings. The grand illusion is complete, and the architects of the shadow have already won, simply by refusing to play our game. Look at the High Street tomb now, buried under the dead weight of a New England winter. The snow falls quietly, burying the sandstone just as time buries the men who built it. I've spent years pulling at the invisible threads radiating from this single windowless anomaly, expecting to find a master blueprint for the American empire. But the final truth is far more devastating than any cinematic conspiracy. We began this investigation staring at a black hole, a mathematical anomaly where 15 college juniors routinely inherited the Earth. We mapped their bloodlines, scraped their financial data across a century of warfare, and de-anonymized the shadow architecture of the intelligence state. I wanted a villain. I wanted a smoky room where conscious malice sat at the head of the table, pulling the strings of our reality. But the ultimate secret of Skull and Bones is a profound, almost pathetic emptiness. There is no magic hidden behind those padlocks. There is no esoteric cosmic truth etched into the basement walls. As I sifted through the archives, what I found was not an omnipotent cabal, but the brutal, compounding interest of human connections. The empire was not built on supernatural design, but on the psychology of frightened boys. Power is, at its absolute core, a biological imperative. It is the ancient, evolutionary fear of chaos translated into modern geopolitics. When you force a group of young men to bear their deepest shame in absolute darkness, you do not just forge a friendship. You manufacture a psychological shield against a terrifyingly unpredictable world. That localized trauma scales perfectly into the macrocosm of nuclear hegemony. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction during the Cold War was simply the geopolitical echo of that windowless room. The men who engineered global surveillance networks and dictated foreign interventions through private capital were merely replicating the only safety they ever knew. They controlled the physics of the future not out of some grand, malevolent genius, but out of an animalistic desire for total control. And this is where the sociological crime intersects with your daily life. You spend your finite energy debating political theater, believing that the correct vote or the right ideology can alter the trajectory of the machine. But the Overton window was framed by a social architecture you are fundamentally locked out of. You cannot dismantle a root system by trimming the leaves of a tree that was planted a century ago. Here in the year 2026, the tragedy of our digital age is that we finally have the optics to see the cage. Advanced algorithms and open-source intelligence have illuminated the entire web of historical overlaps and demographic monopolies. We can mathematically prove that over 40% of modern pivot points trace back to a fraction of a percent of the population. We have the data, but data is not power. As the camera of our collective awareness pulls back higher and higher, the sandstone tomb and the Yale campus shrink away. From the silent, freezing void of low Earth orbit, our entire world is reduced to a pale blue dot. We constantly look out to the stars for grand, philosophical answers to our suffering, hoping for a supreme observer to make sense of the madness. But the universe is magnificently indifferent to us.
That indifference is the most vital lesson of this entire investigation.
The heavy chains of our geopolitical reality were not forged by the gods, nor were they mandated by the cosmos. They were forged by frightened young men in the dark, whispering their secrets to one another to keep the terrifying randomness of life at bay. They simply recognized the gravity of human networking, centuries before we even had a name for it.
We are the blind passengers on a ship steered by these ghosts of the past. But the architecture of their influence only functions because we consent to play by the rules of their isolation. They capitalized on the fundamental biological need for exclusion. The only way to break the cycle of class reproduction is to stop fighting their shadows and start cultivating our own hyper-connected ecosystems of mutual defense. If power is a slow-growing root system, then we must become the new soil. We must stop relying on the rusted mechanisms of an empire that was designed to exclude us. In a world where artificial intelligence attempts to dictate our reality and condense our choices into predictable algorithms, the last remaining friction is genuine, unbreakable human solidarity. The antidote to their darkness is an uncompromising transparency. We have dragged the mathematics of the shadow government into the light, and now the investigation belongs to you. If this forensic analysis has shattered your previous understanding of how history is actually engineered, leave your verdict in the comments below. Hitting the like button and subscribing to this channel is not just a digital metric. It is your active participation in building a new network of truth in the open. You now possess the analytical optic to see the invisible strings that bind the highest echelons of finance to the deepest vaults of intelligence. The illusion has been comprehensively dismantled. You know that the greatest danger is not a conscious conspiracy, but the terrifyingly mundane machinery of elite sociology. The truth is heavy, but in that profound weight lies your ultimate liberation from the political hallucination. The snow will eventually cover the tracks we have uncovered today, but the blueprint of the empire is now permanently etched into your awareness. We are but a fleeting moment of consciousness in a cold universe, yet we have the unprecedented power to rewrite the code of our own civilization. The file on the ghosts of New Haven is officially closed, but your real work is just beginning. Stay vigilant, and I will see you next time.